It was a bitterly cold Friday evening when the dispatcher at the 911 call center received an urgent and disorienting call. The phone rang sharply, cutting through the stillness of the office. The dispatcher picked it up, greeting the caller with practiced calm. 911, what's your emergency? The voice on the other end was high-pitched, trembling with panic, barely above a whisper. Please, you have to help me. I think someone's in my house. The woman's voice was shaking uncontrollably, and it was evident she was struggling to keep her composure. Ma'am, calm down. I need you to tell me your address so we can send help. The dispatcher responded, her voice steady but growing concerned as she noted the woman's panic. There was a pause on the line before the woman spoke again, each word ragged and disjointed. It's 412 Holloway Lane. Please, they're in the attic. I can hear them moving around. I'm so scared. I don't know who they are. Please, I'm alone. I don't know if I'll make it. The dispatcher quickly wrote down the address, her hand trembling. Holloway Lane was an isolated area, known for its desolate and abandoned houses. She knew that this particular address had been vacant for years, so the request was odd, almost impossible. Stay on the line, ma'am, the dispatcher urged, trying to keep the woman talking. We're sending officers to your location right now. But then the voice faltered. There was a sudden sharp intake of breath followed by a chilling silence. The dispatcher waited, hoping to hear the woman's voice again, but there was nothing. No breathing, no sounds at all. The call had abruptly dropped. A knot formed in the dispatcher's stomach. There had been something unnerving about the woman's voice. A sense of urgency that didn't sit right, coupled with the eerie quiet in the background. Was this a prank? Or something far worse? Her instincts screamed at her to act quickly. The dispatcher immediately relayed the call to the nearest patrol unit, a pair of officers stationed nearby. She marked the address on her map, but even as she did, a sinking feeling gripped her chest. 412 Holloway Lane. No one had lived there for years. It was a place of decay. She shuddered, praying that the officers would arrive in time to save whoever was in danger. As soon as the call disconnected, the dispatcher immediately took to calling the officers on duty. Her thoughts raced. The woman had sounded desperate, yet the call itself had been eerily quiet at times, almost hollow. The absence of background noise was unsettling. In most emergency calls, there was noise, the sound of a bustling environment, street traffic, or other incidental noises. But here, it was as if the woman were speaking from a place where everything was eerily still, almost lifeless. Her first instinct was to treat the call as an isolated situation, a simple home intruder case. But as she replayed the details in her mind, doubts began to creep in. Why would anyone be in an abandoned house? The houses on Holloway Lane had been condemned and left to rot. It had been over a decade since anyone lived there. The entire area was known for its creepy, desolate atmosphere. The dispatcher could not shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. She immediately sent Officer Hartley and Officer Adams, two seasoned officers familiar with the area. The dispatcher knew they would respond quickly, but the dread that settled deep in her chest made her uneasy. As the officers sped toward Holloway Lane, she kept herself busy by reviewing the house's details. She noted that it was located deep in the woods, a mile away from any other inhabited buildings. The dead silence of the neighborhood seemed to press in on her mind, almost suffocating. When she tried to reach the woman again, there was no answer. The phone rang and rang, but the line remained open, silent. Then the phone's signal cut out entirely, leaving the night seemed to stretch on for an eternity as Officer Hartley and Officer Adams made their way to 412 Holloway Lane. They had driven through winding, narrow roads, the headlights of their patrol car slicing through the inky darkness. The deeper they went into the woods, the more isolated and haunting the surroundings became. The tall trees created long, eerie shadows across the road. Even the usual sounds of wildlife seemed to vanish, replaced by an unnerving silence. Officer Hartley, a man in his mid-30s with a commanding presence, kept his eyes on the road, his mind focused on the task ahead. His partner, Officer Adams, was more cautious by nature, his hand gripping the radio, constantly trying to reach the dispatcher. But there was no response. As the patrol car neared the address, they both spotted the house. It stood in front of them, a dilapidated shell of what was once a stately home. The windows were broken and the door hung loosely on its hinges, flapping in the wind like a decaying flag. It looked as though the house had been abandoned for decades, yet there was a faint glow emanating from within, an unsettling sight given the fact that there was no electricity in the area. They parked their patrol car in front of the house, the headlights shining on the long abandoned garden. The air was thick, oppressive. Everything about the place screamed danger. They stepped out of the car, their footsteps crunching against the overgrown grass. Hartley gave Adams a glance, but neither of them spoke. They both knew this wasn't a typical call. This was something else. The officers hesitated only briefly before approaching the front door, which hung off its hinges, swaying gently in the breeze. The house was completely silent, as though the world outside had forgotten it existed. The wood creaked under their boots as they made their way inside, flashlights piercing the darkness of the long abandoned hallway. The air inside was musty, filled with the scent of mold and decay. A chill seemed to hang in the air despite the warmth outside. The officers exchanged wary glances, trying to stay alert. There was something wrong about the house. It didn't feel like a home. It felt empty, as if it had been untouched for decades. "Ma'am," Officer Hartley called out, his voice echoing through the hollow space. "Are you in here? We're with the police. We're here to help." There was no response at first. They moved deeper into the house, their footsteps muted. On the old wooden floors, the silence was unnerving, thick and suffocating. Their flashlights danced across the walls, illuminating old family portraits, cracked mirrors, and long-forgotten furniture. The whole place looked as though it had been frozen in time. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Officer Adams called out, his voice uncertain. "We're coming in. If you're inside, we need to know." That's when they heard it, a faint, almost inaudible voice coming from upstairs. "Please, help me." The voice trembled with fear, so faint that it was almost lost in the stillness. The officers stopped dead in their tracks. They both heard it clear as day, but no one had entered the house. There was no one else here. "Did you hear that?" Officer Adams asked, his eyes wide with concern. Hartley nodded, but his heart was already racing. The voice had sounded so real. As the officers moved deeper into the abandoned house, an overwhelming feeling of dread began to settle over them. The house, once a home, now felt like a mournful, forgotten place, its air heavy, stale, and unwelcoming. The flashlight beams flickered as they panned over the debris-covered floor, revealing nothing more than broken furniture, shattered glass, and peeling wallpaper. Yet the deeper they ventured into the house, the more they began to feel as if Officer Hartley, usually the more composed of the two, found his hand shaking slightly as he held the flashlight, his mind racing. The house felt as though it had a life of its own, as if the walls were alive with secrets, holding something at bay. The silence was almost unnatural, like a heavy weight pressing in on their every move. The sound of their footsteps seemed to echo unnervingly loud in the empty house, each step seeming to magnify the tension. The officers were used to dangerous, Situations, home invasions, domestic disputes, even armed robberies. But this felt different. As they ascended the stairs to the second floor, the quiet was broken only by the creaking of the old wood under their feet. Suddenly, the faintest sound reached their ears. Barely noticeable at first, a soft scratching noise like nails dragging across a surface. It was coming from somewhere ahead, deeper within the house. The sound was rhythmic, methodical, and it made both officers freeze in their tracks. "Did you hear that?" Officer Adams whispered, his voice strained. Hartley nodded, but his gaze flickered nervously to the attic door at the end of the hallway. It stood ajar, the faintest glimmer of light peeking through the cracks, though no source of light could be seen from outside. The scratching grew louder. It was coming from the attic. The officers exchanged a look. Something was in the attic. Without a word, they moved toward the door, their bodies tense with anticipation. Each step toward it seemed to drag on, and the oppressive silence made it feel as though the house was holding its breath. As they approached the attic door, the officers' nerves were on edge. The soft scratching had stopped, but a low, anguished voice filled the air. It was the woman's voice again, but this time it wasn't simply a plea for help. It sounded broken, defeated. "Please, help me. They won't stop. They won't let me go." The voice was faint, but it seemed to resonate in the walls around them. The officers hesitated, looking at each other with growing unease. Hartley swallowed, trying to steady his nerves. "We need to get in there," he said, though his voice was unsteady. Adams nodded and reached for the door handle, but as his fingers brushed it, the sound of the woman's voice suddenly ceased. The house became eerily still once again, the air thick with tension. The officers exchanged another wary glance. There was something wrong about this, something they couldn't put their finger on. They pushed the door open, stepping cautiously, into the attic. The room was cold, almost unnaturally so. Dust hung heavy in the air and cobwebs clung to the rafters. There was no one there. The officers swept the room with their flashlights, but there were no signs of life. No woman, no intruder. The space seemed empty, save for some old furniture covered in dust. Yet as they took a few more steps, they felt the sudden chill again. The temperature had dropped even further, and then they heard it. A loud thud, as though something had fallen, in the corner of the room. The sound seemed to echo out of nowhere, sending both officers into alert mode. They quickly turned, shining their flashlights in all directions. But once again, the room was empty. "Did you hear that?" Adams asked, his voice laced with anxiety. Hartley simply nodded, his pulse quickening. The sound seemed to come from all directions at once, yet there was still no one there. A wave of horror washed over the officers as they stood in the attic, the unsettling sound surrounding them. It was then that the realization hit them hard. They weren't just dealing with a typical intruder situation. This was something much more sinister. The woman they had spoken to on the phone, the one who had begged them for help, she wasn't real. There was no way she could have been. Both officers were familiar with the area. They knew that 412 Holloway Lane had been abandoned for years. The house had been condemned and left to rot. No one had lived there for decades. The records confirmed, and yet, here they were inside the house, speaking to what seemed to be an invisible force. It couldn't have been a prank call. It had been too vivid, too real. As they stood in the center of the attic, the scratching noises began again, louder this time. The sounds were almost unbearable, reverberating through the walls. They had no idea where they were coming from. They checked the windows, the walls, the corners of the room, Nothing. Officer Hartley's heart began to race. The air was getting colder. His breath fogged up in the freezing air. He turned to Adams, his voice tight with panic. "We need to leave. Now." Adams too felt it, the presence that lingered in the room. Something was watching them. Just as the officers started to back toward the door, the radio crackled to life with an unexpected message from the dispatcher. "Officers, we've checked the records for 412 Holloway Lane. There's no one listed at that address. There's no record of a woman calling in tonight either. The house has been abandoned for over 30 years." The chilling words from the dispatcher seemed to freeze time for a moment. The truth sank in. They weren't dealing with a living person. They were dealing with a ghost, a trapped spirit who had somehow managed to make a call from beyond. The realization was like a cold slap in the face, but it only made the situation more terrifying. The woman who had begged for help wasn't alive. She hadn't been alive for decades. The officers were not responding to an emergency. They had just become part of something much darker than they could ever have imagined. In that moment, as the weight of the situation hit them, the officers turned and fled. Their boots pounded against the creaking floorboards as they ran toward the stairs, hearts pounding in their chests. But as they reached the staircase, something slammed shut behind them. The attic door. The officers froze. Behind them, they could hear the unmistakable sound of something moving, a scraping, dragging sound getting closer with every passing second. Someone or something was following them. Officer Hartley's breath caught in his throat as the sound grew louder, and they felt the oppressive weight of the house closing in on them. The presence was coming after them. With everything they had, they ran toward the front door, which seemed to stretch farther away the closer they got. The shadows seemed to grow longer, and the walls seemed to pulse with life. Finally, they burst out of the front door and onto the porch, gasping for air. They didn't stop running until they reached their patrol car. As the officers sped away from 412 Holloway Lane, they glanced back, catching one last glimpse of the house in their rearview mirror. For a fleeting moment, the officers swore they saw a shadowy figure standing in the attic window, watching them leave. That night, the officers didn't speak. They couldn't. There were no words for what they had just experienced. The house on Holloway Lane remained standing, empty and decaying, and to this day no one has dared to go near it again. The police department never spoke about the incident again. The haunting call, the chilling sounds, the ghostly presence. No one dared to ask any more questions. But local legend says that if you listen closely on a quiet, cold night, you can still hear the faint sound of a woman's voice pleading for help from a house that no one dares to